Catherine lived the kind of life most people wouldn't associate with wealth. Sure, her husband owned a successful airline company, but you'd never know it by looking at her daily routine. While he spent his days in board meetings and business trips, she spent hers teaching piano lessons to kids in their neighborhood and working in her small vegetable garden behind their house. She liked it that way. Simple, quiet, real. Most people in town had no idea who her husband was. When she introduced herself at the local grocery store or the community center, she used her maiden name. Not because she was hiding anything, but because she'd learned years ago that once people knew about the money, everything changed. Suddenly, conversations felt different. Friendships felt transactional. So she just kept that part of her life private. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Catherine was kneeling in her garden, pulling weeds from around her tomato plants, when her phone rang. It was her younger sister, calling from 3 states away. The moment Catherine heard her voice, she knew something was wrong. Their mother had fallen. A bad fall. The kind that's especially dangerous for someone in their 70s. She was in the hospital, stable but needing surgery on her hip. Her sister's voice cracked as she explained that the doctors wanted to operate within the next 2 days. Catherine didn't hesitate for even a second. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her jeans, and went straight inside. Her husband was somewhere over the Atlantic at that moment, heading to a conference in London. She thought about calling him but decided against it. He had enough on his plate, and besides, this was something she needed to handle on her own. Her mother needed her, and that was all that mattered. She grabbed her laptop and pulled up the first flight booking website she could find. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, searching for any available flight that could get her there fast. The earliest option that popped up was leaving in 4 hours from the local airport. The Airline? It happened to be her husband's company. She almost laughed at the coincidence but didn't think much of it. A flight was a flight. The ticket was for economy class. She booked it without a second thought, entering her maiden name like she always did for personal travel. Catherine had flown first class plenty of times when traveling with her husband for company events. But when she flew alone, she always booked economy. It felt more comfortable to her somehow. Less attention, less fuss. She threw some clothes into an old duffel bag. A couple pairs of jeans, some t-shirts, a sweater, comfortable shoes. She wasn't packing for fashion. She was packing to sit in a hospital room and hold her mother's hand. She grabbed her phone charger, her toothbrush, and a book she'd been reading, then headed out the door. The drive to the airport was a blur. Her mind kept replaying her sister's words. Their mother had been doing so well lately. Just last week, they'd talked on the phone, and she'd been telling Catherine about the new flowers she'd planted in her front yard. How she was in a hospital bed, probably scared and in pain. Catherine parked in the economy lot. She could have used the executive parking that came with her husband's position, but she didn't even think about it. She pulled her duffel bag over her shoulder and walked toward the terminal, her worn sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. At the check-in counter, the agent barely looked up as she processed Catherine's ticket. It was a routine transaction. Economy seat, row 28, middle seat. Catherine took her boarding pass and headed through security. The security line moved slowly. A family ahead of her was struggling to get their stroller folded up. A businessman behind her kept sighing impatiently and checking his watch. Catherine stood quietly, her mind elsewhere. She was mentally preparing herself for what she might see when she got to the hospital. Her mother had always been so strong, so independent. The thought of her lying helpless in a hospital bed made Catherine's chest tight with worry. Finally, through security, she found her gate and sat down in one of the hard plastic chairs. The airport was busy, filled with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates, kids crying, announcements echoing overhead. Catherine pulled out her phone and texted her sister to let her know she was at the airport and would be there by evening. When boarding was called, Catherine waited until her group number was announced. She walked down the jetway with her bag, showed her boarding pass to the flight attendant at the door, and made her way down the narrow aisle toward the back of the plane. Row 28 was near the rear galley. She could already hear the sounds of flight attendants preparing for takeoff, the clinking of ice in containers, the rustle of service items being arranged. The seats on either side of hers were already occupied. A man in a suit sat by the window, his laptop open and his fingers flying across the keyboard. A young woman with headphones sat in the aisle seat, her eyes closed and her head already bobbing slightly to whatever music she was listening to. Catherine squeezed past the young woman with a quiet, "Excuse me," and settled into the middle seat. It was cramped, as middle seats always are. Her knees pressed against the seat in front of her. She tucked her bag under the seat and buckled her seatbelt. The plane was filling up quickly. People shuffled past, shoving bags into overhead bins, settling into their seats with the usual pre-flight routine. Catherine pulled out her phone to send one more text to her sister, then switched it to airplane mode. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. The worry about her mother sat heavy in her chest. She wished she could fast forward through this flight and just be there already, holding her mother's hand and telling her everything would be okay. Around her, the plane buzzed with the energy of dozens of separate lives, separate journeys, separate stories, business travelers heading to meetings, families going on vacation, students returning to college, and Catherine, a daughter rushing to her mother's side, wearing her gardening jeans and an old sweater, looking like any other passenger heading anywhere. She had no idea that this ordinary flight, this simple journey taken out of love and worry, was about to become anything but ordinary. She had no idea that the very airline her husband had built from the ground up was about to fail her in the most personal way possible. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Catherine barely paid attention. She'd heard it hundreds of times before. Her mind was already 3 states away in a hospital room, with her mother. The plane's engines roared to life, and Catherine felt the familiar sensation of being pushed back into her seat as they prepared for takeoff. She glanced out the window past the businessman, watching the ground crew doing their final checks on the tarmac. Everything seemed normal. Routine. But about 20 minutes before they were scheduled to depart, something changed. A flight attendant came striding down the aisle with purpose. She was older, probably in her late 40s, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and a name tag that read Victoria. There was something about the way she moved that made Catherine pay attention. This wasn't the casual walk of someone doing a routine cabin check. This was someone on a mission. Victoria stopped right next to Catherine's row. She looked directly at Catherine, and there was something in her expression that made Catherine's stomach drop. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't even neutral. It was cold. "Excuse me, ma'am," Victoria said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the cabin. "I need to see your boarding pass." Catherine blinked, confused. She'd already shown her boarding pass when she boarded. But she didn't argue. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper, handing it over. Victoria examined it like she was looking for evidence of a crime. She held it up to the light, checked it front and back, then looked at Catherine again. This time her eyes traveled slowly from Catherine's face down to her faded jeans, her old sweater with a small hole near the hem, and her scuffed sneakers. "Ma'am," Victoria said, loud enough that passengers in the rows ahead and behind could clearly hear, "this boarding pass shows you're in economy class. You're in the correct seat, but we've received a complaint." Catherine's heart started beating faster. "A complaint? About what?" "A complaint that you've been bothering first-class passengers," Victoria said, each word deliberate and accusatory. Catherine felt her face flush hot. "I haven't left this seat since I boarded. I came straight back here and sat down. I haven't been anywhere near first class." The businessman next to her shifted uncomfortably, his typing stopping. The young woman with the headphones had opened her eyes and was now watching the interaction with wide-eyed interest. Across the aisle, other passengers were turning to look. Victoria crossed her arms. "Nevertheless, I need to remind you that first class is off-limits to economy passengers. We've been having issues lately with people trying to upgrade themselves without authorization. Some passengers think they can just walk up there and claim an empty seat. I understand the policy," Catherine said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady even though she felt humiliated. "But I haven't done anything like that. I've been sitting right here." Victoria gave her a look that clearly said she didn't believe her. "Well, just make sure you stay in your assigned seat for the duration of the flight. We can't have economy passengers wandering around where they don't belong." The word stung. Where they don't belong. As if Catherine was somehow less than human because of where she was sitting. As if the price of her ticket determined her worth as a person. Victoria walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the floor of the cabin. Catherine sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked away quickly. embarrassed for her or perhaps embarrassed by the scene they'd just witnessed. The businessman beside her cleared his throat awkwardly and went back to his laptop, though he didn't seem to actually be working anymore. The young woman with the headphones put them back on, but Catherine could tell she was still paying attention. Catherine wanted to cry. She wanted to stand up and defend herself. She wanted to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong. But most of all, she just wanted to disappear. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She thought about her mother lying in that hospital bed. That was what mattered, not this. Not some flight attendant who'd decided to judge her based on her appearance. The plane finally took off. Catherine stared at the seat back in front of her, not really seeing it. Her mind was racing. Had someone really complained about her? Or had Victoria just assumed something about her because of how she looked? Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done. She'd been publicly humiliated in front of dozens of strangers. About 30 minutes into the flight, the beverage service began. Catherine watched as flight attendants moved through the cabin with their carts. There was a younger attendant, probably in her mid-20s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. Her name tag said Diane. She smiled warmly at passengers as she served them, asked follow-up questions, seemed genuinely interested in making people comfortable. But then Victoria appeared, taking over the cart for Catherine's section of the cabin. The difference was immediate. While Diane had been warm and friendly with the passengers in the rows ahead, Victoria was cold and efficient with Catherine's row. She handed drinks to the businessman and the young woman with barely a word, but when she got to Catherine, she simply said, "What do you want?" With no smile, no warmth, nothing. "Could I have some water, please?" Catherine asked softly. Victoria sighed like this was an enormous inconvenience. "We'll get to everyone eventually. Just hold on." But she'd just served the people on either side of Catherine. The water was right there on the cart. It would have taken 5 seconds to hand her a cup. Instead, Victoria moved on to the next row, serving those passengers promptly and even adding a smile. Catherine sat there stunned. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. This was deliberate. This was Victoria treating her differently, worse than other passengers for no reason other than how she looked. Diane, the younger flight attendant, came by a few minutes later. When she got to Catherine's row, she paused. "Did you receive your beverage, ma'am?" she asked. "Not yet," Catherine said quietly. Diane's face showed concern. "I'm so sorry about that. What can I get you?" "Just water would be great." "Thank you." Diane quickly got her a cup of water and, Catherine noticed, added an extra pack of cookies to her napkin. When their eyes met, Diane gave her a small, apologetic smile. It was subtle, but Catherine understood. Diane knew what was happening. She'd seen it, and she was trying in her small way to make up for it. It helped. A little. But it didn't erase the humiliation. Throughout the flight, Victoria made several more trips past Catherine's row. Each time she'd slow down slightly, glance at Catherine as if checking to make sure she was staying in her place. It was subtle enough that maybe some passengers didn't notice, but Catherine felt it every time. She felt watched, suspected, judged. At one point, Catherine needed to use the restroom. She'd been holding it, not wanting to draw any more attention to herself. But finally, she couldn't wait any longer. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, carefully squeezing past the young woman in the aisle seat. As she walked toward the back of the plane where the restrooms were located, she felt Victoria's eyes on her. She glanced over and saw the flight attendant watching her, arms crossed, like she was waiting for Catherine to do something wrong. Catherine used the restroom quickly and returned to her seat, her face burning. This was ridiculous. She was a paying passenger. She had every right to use the restroom, but Victoria was making her feel like a criminal for simply existing on this plane. The worst moment came about an hour into the flight. Catherine was pretending to read her book, though she hadn't absorbed a single word when she heard voices from the galley behind her. The galley was separated from the passenger cabin by just a thin curtain, and the flight attendants clearly thought they were speaking quietly enough that passengers wouldn't hear, but Catherine heard every word. "Economy passengers are getting so entitled these days," Victoria was saying. "They see who owns the airline, probably read about him in some magazine, and think they can talk their way into first class." Another voice, one Catherine didn't recognize, murmured something in response. "I'm serious," Victoria continued. You should have seen this one woman, dressed like she just rolled out of bed. Old jeans, ratty sweater. Probably saw an empty first-class seat and thought she'd try her luck. I had to put her in her place. Catherine's hands gripped her book so hard her knuckles turned white. She was this one woman. Victoria was talking about her, making assumptions about her, telling other crew members that she'd tried to sneak into first class when Catherine had done absolutely nothing of the sort. The businessman next to her had stopped typing again. Catherine realized he could hear the conversation too. So could several other passengers nearby. They all sat in uncomfortable silence, pretending not to hear while hearing everything. Catherine closed her eyes. Tears threatened to spill over, but she refused to let them. She wouldn't give Victoria the satisfaction. She wouldn't let this horrible woman see her cry. She thought about her mother again. Strong, dignified, kind. What would her mother do in this situation? Probably exactly what Catherine was doing. Endure it, stay quiet, rise above it. But inside, Catherine felt something else building alongside the humiliation. It was anger. Not at Victoria specifically, though she certainly deserved it. But anger at the whole situation. At the fact that someone could treat another human being this way simply because of their clothes. Simply because of where they were sitting on a plane. Every passenger on this plane had paid for their ticket. Every passenger deserved to be treated with basic respect and dignity. That shouldn't be a privilege reserved for first class. That should be a given. The rest of the flight stretched on like torture. Catherine couldn't wait to land, to get off this plane and away from Victoria's judging eyes. She kept her head down, her book open but unread, counting the minutes until this nightmare would be over. When the pilot finally announced their descent, Catherine felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made her dizzy. Soon she'd be off this plane. Soon she'd be with her mother. Soon this whole horrible experience would be behind her. But what Catherine didn't know was that this experience was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. The plane touched down with a slight bump, and Catherine felt the tension in her shoulders ease just a fraction. The ordeal was almost over. Just a few more minutes and she'd be off this aircraft and away from Victoria's hostile presence. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers around her began gathering their belongings, pulling bags from overhead compartments, checking their phones. Catherine stayed in her seat, waiting for the aisle to clear. She had no desire to push and shove her way out. She just wanted to leave quietly and put this whole experience behind her. The businessman beside her stood and retrieved his carry-on from the overhead bin. As he did, he glanced down at Catherine. "I'm sorry about what happened to you," he said quietly. "That wasn't right." Catherine looked up at him surprised. "Thank you," she managed to say. He nodded and moved into the aisle, joining the stream of departing passengers. That small gesture of kindness, that acknowledgement from a stranger that she'd been treated unfairly, meant more than he probably knew. Finally, the rows ahead cleared enough for Catherine to stand. She pulled her duffel bag from under the seat and stepped into the aisle. As she walked toward the front of the plane, she kept her eyes down, not wanting to make eye contact with any of the crew members. But as she approached the exit, someone touched her arm gently. It was Diane, the younger flight attendant who'd brought her the water and extra cookies. "Mrs. Peterson," Diane whispered urgently, using Catherine's married name. Catherine stopped, confused. How did this young woman know her married name? She'd booked the ticket under her maiden name. Diane's face was flushed and she looked distressed. "I recognized you from the company holiday party last year. I'm so sorry about what happened today. The way Victoria treated you was completely unacceptable." Catherine felt her stomach drop. The company holiday party, of course. Her husband always invited the entire staff to a big celebration every December. Catherine had attended last year, though she'd spent most of the evening in the corner talking to the catering staff about their recipes, rather than mingling with executives. "Please," Catherine said softly, gripping Diane's hand. "Please don't say anything. It was just a misunderstanding." "I don't want anyone to get in trouble." Diane's eyes widened. "But she treated you terribly. She humiliated you in front of the entire cabin, and she has no idea that you're—" "Exactly," Catherine interrupted gently but firmly. "She has no idea, and I'd like to keep it that way. Can you do that for me, please?" Diane looked torn, like she was wrestling with her conscience. "I just feel like someone should know. This isn't okay. You're not the first passenger Victoria has treated this way. but you might be the only one who can actually do something about it. Catherine shook her head. The fact that I'm married to who I'm married to shouldn't matter. Every passenger deserves to be treated well, whether they're connected to the owner or not. Promise me you won't say anything. Diane hesitated, then finally nodded. If that's what you want. But please know that I'm truly sorry. This isn't what our airline is supposed to be about. Catherine squeezed her hand once more, then continued off the plane. As she walked up the jetway, her mind was racing. She hadn't thought about how her husband's employees might recognize her. She'd been so focused on her mother, so caught up in the immediate stress of the situation that it hadn't even occurred to her. But now she realized the implications. If Diane recognized her, others might too. This situation could blow up in ways Catherine hadn't anticipated. And the last thing she wanted was for this to become some big scandal where Victoria got fired because of who Catherine was married to. That would miss the entire point. Catherine made her way through the airport, found the rental car counter, and drove straight to the hospital. The moment she walked into her mother's room and saw her lying there, pale but awake, everything else faded into the background. She rushed to her bedside, took her hand, and felt tears finally spill over. "Oh, sweetheart," her mother said, her voice weak but warm. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Of course I did," Catherine said, wiping her eyes. "Where else would I be?" Her sister stood on the other side of the bed, looking exhausted but relieved. The three of them talked about the surgery scheduled for the next morning, about what the doctors had said about the recovery timeline. Catherine pushed the flight experience to the back of her mind. Her mother needed her full attention. She spent that night in an uncomfortable chair next to her mother's bed, dozing fitfully. The next day was consumed with the surgery and the anxious waiting that came with it. When the surgeon finally emerged to say everything had gone well, Catherine felt like she could breathe again for the first time in 2 days. But on the third day, as her mother slept peacefully in recovery, and her sister went home to shower and change clothes, Catherine found herself alone with her thoughts. And those thoughts kept circling back to the flight, to Victoria's cold eyes and harsh words, to the humiliation of being accused of something she hadn't done, to the sound of Victoria talking about her in the galley, making assumptions and spreading them to other crew members. Catherine pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long moment. She should call her husband. He'd returned from London and had been texting her updates about the business, asking about her mother, telling her he loved her. But she hadn't mentioned the flight. She'd told herself she was too busy, too focused on her mother, but the truth was she didn't know how to talk about it. Before she could decide whether to call him, her phone rang. It was him. "Hey," she answered, trying to sound normal. "Hey yourself," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her sit up straighter. "Catherine, I need to talk to you about something. When were you planning to tell me about your flight?" Her blood ran cold. "How did you—" "A passenger filed a complaint. A very detailed complaint. It came through the customer service system 2 days ago, and it just reached my desk this morning. The complaint didn't mention your name, but it described the flight number, the date, and the incident in enough detail that I pulled the passenger manifest and the cabin footage." Catherine closed her eyes. Cabin footage. Of course there was cabin footage. Modern planes had cameras throughout the cabin for security purposes. "I watched it, Catherine," he continued, and now she could hear the anger in his voice. Not anger at her, anger for her. "I watched that flight attendant humiliate you in front of a packed cabin. I heard what she said in the galley, and I'm furious." "It was just a misunderstanding," Catherine started. "No," he cut her off firmly. "No, it wasn't. This was discrimination. This was a member of my staff treating a passenger poorly because of how they looked and where they were sitting. And the fact that the passenger happened to be you makes me angrier. But it doesn't change the fundamental problem." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Who filed the complaint?" "A man named Robert Chen. Apparently he's a consultant who flies with us regularly. He said he witnessed the entire incident and found it deeply disturbing. He wrote that he'd never seen such blatant discrimination on any flight, with any airline, and that if this was the standard of service we provided, he'd be taking his business elsewhere." "I don't want her to lose her job," Catherine said quietly. "This isn't about revenge, Catherine. This is bigger than that. I pulled Victoria's file. This isn't the first complaint about her. There have been others over the past 6 months. Nothing quite this blatant, but a pattern of dismissive behavior toward economy passengers. Your incident was just the catalyst that made us look closer. Catherine thought about Diane, the young flight attendant who'd apologized. Who'd said Catherine wasn't the first passenger Victoria had treated this way. It made sense now. What are you going to do? She asked. What I should have done months ago when the first complaint started coming in. Victoria is being placed on immediate leave while we conduct a full investigation. If the investigation confirms what I saw in that footage and what other passengers have reported, she'll face serious consequences. But more than that, we need to look at our entire training program. If one flight attendant can treat passengers this way, what does that say about our culture? Catherine felt something shift inside her. Her husband was right. This wasn't about her. This was about every passenger who'd ever been made to feel less than because of their appearance or their seat assignment. This was about the kind of airline they claimed to be versus the kind of airline they actually were. I want to help, she said suddenly. Help? With the training program. With fixing this. I don't want this to be about me, about who I'm married to. But I want to make sure that no other passenger ever feels the way I felt on that flight. Her husband was quiet for a moment. Are you sure? This might mean talking about what happened to you. Being more public about your connection to the company. Catherine looked at her mother sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed. Her mother, who'd taught her that everyone deserved kindness, that your worth as a person had nothing to do with your bank account or your status, that the true measure of character was how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you. I'm sure, Catherine said, but I want to do it the right way. Not as the owner's wife coming down to punish people, as someone who experienced firsthand what happens when a company loses sight of its values. Okay, he said softly. We'll do this together. But first come home. Your mother is stable, your sister is there, and you need some rest. We can figure out the details later. After they hung up, Catherine sat in the quiet hospital room thinking. She thought about Victoria, who was probably at home right now, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. Part of Catherine felt bad about that. But a larger part knew that sometimes consequences were necessary. Not for revenge, but for growth, for change. She thought about Diane, the young flight attendant who tried to make things right with an extra pack of cookies and an apologetic smile. She hoped Diane wouldn't get caught in the crossfire of whatever investigation was coming, and she thought about Robert Chen, a passenger she'd never met, who'd taken the time to file a detailed complaint because he'd witnessed an injustice. That gave her hope. It meant there were people out there who cared, who noticed, who refused to let bad behavior slide just because it didn't directly affect them. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. She was on her way back to the hospital with dinner. Catherine stood and stretched, her back aching from the uncomfortable chair. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below, watching people come and go, strangers living their lives, fighting their battles, carrying their burdens. Every single one of them deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. That shouldn't be revolutionary. That should be basic human decency. But sometimes Catherine was learning you had to fight for basic human decency. You had to stand up and say, this isn't okay, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was easier to just let it go. She wasn't going to let this go. Not anymore. Catherine returned home 5 days later. Her mother's surgery had been successful, and with her sister there to help with recovery, Catherine felt comfortable leaving. The entire drive to the airport, she thought about the conversation she'd need to have with her husband. Not just about Victoria and the investigation, but about something deeper, about what kind of company they really wanted to run. When she walked through the front door of their house, he was waiting in the living room. He stood immediately, crossing the room to wrap her in a hug. She melted into it, feeling the exhaustion of the past week catch up with her all at once. "How's your mom?" he asked. "Tough as nails," Catherine said with a tired smile. "She's already complaining about being stuck in bed. The doctors say that's a good sign." They sat down on the couch together and he pulled out a tablet. "I need to show you something. The investigation into Victoria's behavior has expanded, and we've uncovered more than I initially thought." Catherine watched as he pulled up a series of documents: complaint records, passenger feedback forms, internal reports from other flight attendants who'd witnessed Victoria's behavior but had been too afraid to report it formally. "Look at this one," he said, pointing to a complaint from 3 months ago. A passenger, a college student flying home for winter break, reported that Victoria made a comment about her outfit being inappropriate and suggested she cover up before walking through first class to use the restroom. The girl said she was wearing jeans and a regular t-shirt. Nothing remotely inappropriate. Catherine felt her stomach turn. What happened with that complaint? It got filed away. The supervisor who handled it talked to Victoria, who claimed the passenger was being oversensitive. Without video evidence or other witnesses willing to come forward, it was her word against the passengers. The supervisor sided with Victoria. He pulled up another document. Here's one from 2 months ago. A man traveling with his elderly father in economy reported that Victoria was impatient and dismissive when his father, who has dementia, got confused about the drink options. She apparently rolled her eyes and made a comment about how some people shouldn't fly if they can't follow simple instructions. Catherine's hands clenched into fists. Please tell me something was done about that one. Another conversation with a supervisor. Another notation in her file. But no real consequences. And here's the thing that really bothers me, Catherine. We have a policy. We have clear standards for how our employees should treat passengers. But those standards weren't being enforced. And I have to take responsibility for that. This happened on my watch. Catherine looked at her husband and saw the genuine anguish on his face. He'd built this airline from the ground up, worked 18-hour days for years to make it successful. She knew how much pride he took in not just the business side, but in the culture. He'd always said he wanted to run an airline where people were treated like people, not just ticket numbers. So what happens now? She asked. Victoria has been placed on unpaid leave pending the completion of the investigation. But honestly, based on what we've found, I don't see how she continues working here. This isn't a one-time mistake. This is a pattern of behavior that we failed to address properly. And the supervisors who didn't handle the complaints appropriately, they're being required to undergo additional training on our complaint procedures and employee accountability. We're also implementing a new system where passenger complaints about staff behavior get escalated higher up the chain automatically, not just handled at the supervisor level. Catherine nodded slowly. That's good, but I think we need to go deeper than that. He looked at her with interest. What are you thinking? I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few days. Victoria is the symptom, not the disease. The disease is the attitude that some passengers matter more than others, that someone's worth is determined by their ticket class or their appearance. And that attitude doesn't just come from one flight attendant. It comes from a culture that allowed it to flourish. Go on, he said. Every person who buys a ticket on our airline is trusting us with their safety, their time, their dignity. Whether they're flying first class or economy, whether they're wearing a business suit or sweatpants, they deserve the same level of respect. We need to rebuild our training from the ground up with that principle at the center. He was quiet for a moment, thinking, You're right. But how do we actually do that? How do we change the culture? We start by acknowledging the problem exists. We bring the entire staff together and we're honest about what happened. Not just my incident, but all of these incidents. We show them that this is serious, that it matters, that we're not going to tolerate it anymore. That's going to be uncomfortable, he said. Good. It should be uncomfortable. Change is uncomfortable, but you know what's more uncomfortable? Being treated like you're less than human because of where you're sitting on a plane. Over the next few weeks, Catherine threw herself into the project. She worked with the airline's human resources department and training coordinators to develop a new comprehensive program. But she didn't just want it to be abstract principles and corporate speak. She wanted it to be real. She reached out to Robert Chen, the consultant who'd filed the complaint about her treatment. He agreed to meet with her at a coffee shop near the airport. I wanted to thank you, Catherine said when they sat down. You didn't have to file that complaint. It didn't affect you personally, but you did it anyway. Robert stirred his coffee thoughtfully. I travel a lot for work. I've seen passengers treated poorly on many airlines. Usually I'm ashamed to admit I don't say anything. I tell myself it's not my business. But what I saw that day crossed a line. That flight attendant wasn't just being curt or having a bad day. She was deliberately humiliating you. And then to hear her talking about you in the galley, making assumptions, spreading those assumptions to other crew members. I couldn't stay silent. Can I ask you something? Catherine said. Would you be willing to share your experience as part of our training program? Not just what you saw on my flight, but your perspective as a frequent flyer, what you've seen across the industry, what good service looks like versus bad service. Robert considered this. If it will help make sure other passengers don't experience what you did, absolutely. Catherine also reached out to some of the other passengers who'd filed complaints about Victoria. Not all of them wanted to participate, which she understood. Some just wanted to move on, but a few agreed to share their stories, to be part of creating something better. She even tracked down the college student who'd been told her outfit was inappropriate. Her name was Lisa, and when Catherine called her, she was hesitant at first. "I honestly thought nothing would come of my complaint," Lisa said. "I figured the airline would side with their employee and I'd just be labeled as some oversensitive kid." "I'm sorry that was your experience," Catherine said. "And I'm sorry nothing was done at the time. But we're trying to change that now. Would you be willing to tell your story?" Lisa agreed, though Catherine could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "What will happen to that flight attendant? Will she get fired?" "That's still being determined," Catherine said honestly. "But this isn't about revenge. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again, to you or anyone else." The day of the company-wide training meeting arrived. Every flight attendant, every gate agent, every member of the customer service team was required to attend, either in person or via video conference. The airline had to adjust schedules and hire temporary coverage to make it work. But Catherine's husband was adamant that everyone needed to be there. Catherine stood backstage in the conference center, her heart pounding. She'd never been comfortable with public speaking, had always preferred to stay in the background. But this was too important to hide behind. Her husband walked out first to address the assembled employees. "Thank you all for being here today. I know this disrupted schedules and I appreciate your flexibility. We're here to talk about something that's at the core of who we are as a company, or at least who we claim to be. We're here to talk about respect." He pulled up the video footage from Catherine's flight on the screen behind him. Catherine had agreed to let him show it, though she'd asked that her face be blurred. She didn't want this to be about her identity. She wanted it to be about the behavior. The room fell silent as they watched. Catherine stood in the wings watching the employees' faces as they saw Victoria's treatment of her. Some looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked down at their hands, perhaps recognizing something in Victoria's behavior that they'd seen in themselves. When the video ended, Catherine's husband spoke again. "The woman in this video is my wife. But that's not why we're showing it to you. We're showing it because this is what happens when we forget that every passenger is a human being, deserving of dignity. This is what happens when we let unchecked biases about class and appearance guide how we treat people." There was a murmur through the crowd. Some employees were putting the pieces together, realizing who the passenger had been. "My wife could have made a phone call immediately after this flight and demanded that the flight attendant be fired," he continued. "But she didn't. You know what she did instead? She went to be with her sick mother, which is why she was on that flight in the first place. And then she came back and asked how we could make sure this never happens to anyone else." He gestured to the side of the stage. "Catherine, would you come out here?" Catherine took a deep breath and walked out onto the stage. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. She saw Diane in the crowd, the young flight attendant from her flight whose face showed a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Hi," Catherine said, her voice a bit shaky at first. "I'm not comfortable with public speaking, so please bear with me. I want to start by saying this isn't about punishment or shame. This is about being honest about where we've fallen short and committing to doing better." She clicked to the next slide, which showed the complaint statistics. These are the complaints we've received over the past year about staff treating passengers dismissively or disrespectfully. Most of them involve economy passengers. Most of them describe staff making assumptions based on appearance or visible wealth, and most of them were not handled appropriately. Catherine paused, making eye contact with different sections of the crowd. "Here's what I learned from my experience. When that flight attendant accused me of trying to sneak into first class, it hurt. Not because I'm married to the owner of this airline, but because I'm a human being who was trying her best to get to her sick mother. My clothes didn't matter. My ticket class didn't matter. What mattered was that I was a person traveling during a difficult time and I deserved to be treated with basic kindness." She could see some people nodding. Others still looked defensive. "I know this job is hard," Catherine continued. "I know you deal with difficult passengers sometimes. I know you're tired and overworked. But here's the thing. That's not an excuse to treat people poorly, and more than that, we as a company have a responsibility to support you in doing this job well. That means better training, That means better systems for handling complaints. That means creating a culture where it's safe to speak up when you see a colleague treating someone badly. She clicked to another slide. Over the next 3 months, every single employee is going to participate in a new training program. It's not going to be boring corporate videos where we all nod off. It's going to include real stories from real passengers. It's going to include scenario training where you practice handling difficult situations. And it's going to include honest conversations about bias and how it affects the way we see and treat people. Catherine took another breath. I want to introduce you to some people. These are passengers who've had experiences on our airline that fell short of our values. They've been brave enough to come here today and share their stories with you. One by one, Robert Chen, Lisa the college student, and 3 other passengers came onto the stage. They each took a few minutes to describe their experiences. The room was silent except for their voices. Catherine watched the employees' faces and saw the impact. These weren't abstract complaints or statistics. These were real people sharing real pain.